Good morning, Speaker. I present the Social Services Legislation Amendment Relieving Domestic Violence Victims of Debt Bill 2017 and the explanatory memorandum.
And I call the clerk.
First reading a bill for an act to amend the law relating to family assistance and social security to allow the debts of people affected by domestic or family violence to be waived and for related purposes.
And I call the member for Denison.
Speaker, I move that this bill now be read a second time. Speaker, in essence, this bill would allow for Centrelink debts to be waived in situations where the debtor has been subjected to domestic violence. Now, the current legislation allows for a debt to be waived in special circumstances, but it is thought that this is vague and may not apply to some situations where a debtor has been a victim of domestic violence. The bill aims to create an explicit category of debt waiver which would assist people in these circumstances and create a clearer legislative basis for Centrelink to waive those debts. Speaker, the bill would also allow for Centrelink debts to be waived when a debtor has, due to being subject to domestic violence, either made a false representation or failed to comply with some other provision of the law. Speaker, there is a gap, regrettably, in the existing legislation which makes this necessary. Centrelink can currently waive a debt when it results from a person not knowingly making a false statement, but this does not take into account people who have been forced to make false statements as a result of domestic violence, even when they may have known it to be false. For example, being forced to misrepresent earnings by an abusive partner. This bill would allow for debts to be waived in all of these circumstances. Speaker, I'm sure all of us in this place have heard many stories about domestic and family violence. I was actually very moved by a particular episode only quite recently, and I must say I think it was the final straw that stirred me to act today. When I met a woman who had been in a violent relationship for nearly 20 years, during which time this woman was physically, sexually, emotionally and financially abused on a daily basis. I'm pleased to say, Speaker, that this woman and her 5 children have now escaped that abusive relationship and partner, but she's been left with a $23,000 Centrelink debt. And she's received this debt, well, she has this debt because when she was in that relationship, she falsely claimed she was single in order to receive more money from Centrelink. But, Speaker, she was forced to do this by her abusive partner and to make other false claims to Centrelink. But in essence, the woman didn't receive the money, had no control of the money, and had no option but to do what her abusive partner demanded that she do. Regrettably, though, because there was fraud involved in this episode, the current legislation does not allow for that debt to be waived, and this unfortunate soul has a debt of $23,000, which somehow she's got to repay. And I think we would all agree that that is a terrible situation and something that we really should look to remedy. Speaker, the story I recount there about that woman, it is, of course, the tip of the iceberg. And I'm sure we have all heard all sorts of stories from our constituents about the troubles that they have endured or do endure. Now, I am mindful that domestic and family violence can be perpetrated by men against women against men. But the overwhelming majority of acts of domestic violence and sexual assault are perpetrated by men against women. And that's a fact. And when I talk about domestic violence, I am using the broader definition, which I think is widely accepted these days, as being any act of gender-based violence that causes or could cause physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering, including threats of harm or coercion in public or private life. As this definition makes clear, violence is not only always physical, it includes psychological, economic, emotional and sexual violence and abuse, and a wide range of controlling, coercive and intimidating behaviour. Speaker, I think to illustrate this point, I would like to read some facts and figures that are published by Our Watch, and I'll quote directly from their website. They are facts and figures to do with violence perpetrated by men against women, because, as I say, it is a fact that the overwhelming majority of acts of domestic violence are perpetrated by men against women. And in fact, if this bill was to receive the support of the parliament and become law, the overwhelming majority of people who would benefit from this reform would be women. But I acknowledge there would also be some men to obtain some benefit from it as well. Some facts and figures, Speaker. On average, at least one woman a week is killed by a partner or former partner in Australia. 1 in 3 Australian women have experienced physical violence since the age of 15. 1 in 5 Australian women has experienced sexual violence. 1 in 4 Australian women has experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 4 Australian women has experienced emotional abuse by a current or former partner. Women are at least 3 times more likely than men to experience violence from an intimate partner. Women are 5 times more likely than men to require medical attention or hospitalisation as a result of intimate partner violence, and 5 times more likely to report fearing for their lives. Of these women who experience violence, more than half have children in their care. Violence against women is not limited to the home or intimate relationships. Every year in Australia, over 300,000 women experience violence, often sexual violence, from someone other than a partner. 8 out of 10 women aged 18 to 34 were harassed on the street in the past year. Young women, 18 to 24, experience significantly higher rates of physical and sexual violence than women in older age groups. And there is a growing evidence that women with disabilities are more likely to experience violence. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experience both far higher rates and more severe forms of violence compared to other women. Speaker, I go through those figures to remind us of the problem we have in this country. In fact, it would be reasonable to say that in this country we still have a family and domestic violence crisis. Now, I do acknowledge that the government has been acting in this space, and I credit the government for that. And in fact, the Turnbull government has announced some $200 million of extra investment to try and do something about domestic and family violence. And that does suggest to me that there should be some interest from the government in supporting this bill today. I would say to the government that the community expects us to act in a collegiate way and to address problems that can be addressed, and this can be easily addressed. For the want of support for this bill and simple legislative change at virtually at no cost or no significant cost to the federal budget, we could bring relief to those people in the community, often women, who, through no fault of their own, are now lumbered with often very large Centrelink debts. This is something that can be supported. It certainly has the support of many legal professionals and many people who work in the community. No less than the Australian Law Reform Commission, in fact, Speaker, would like to see reform in this space. So it's, it's consistent with government policy. It's at virtually nil cost. It's supported by the community and by the legal profession. And it would be consistent with what the community is expecting us to achieve in this place. And that's to come together and to take ideas from wherever they can be found, improve those ideas if they can be improved. And I'm sure my bill could be improved in some way, and some of the bright sparks in the government could probably suggest some amendments to make it even more effective. But that's what the community is expecting us to do. Speaker, the scale of this issue in the community, the scale of domestic and family violence, it's almost an unfathomable scale that in a country like ours, a lawful country, a learned country, that there can be so much domestic and family abuse going on. And it's surprising that we still have a gap in our legislation like this. The fact that, quite simply, that if there is any Centrelink debt and fraud is involved in some way, that debt cannot be waived. In law, it cannot be waived. So surely we should give the Secretary of the Department the ability to waive debts. Think of that woman, 20 years in an abusive relationship, physical, sexual, emotional, financial abuse, through fear of her life, claiming money from Centrelink, which went straight to her former and abusive partner for him to spend and enjoy. But she now has not only got to overcome the emotional difficulties of that past, she's got to pay the debt. So, Speaker, please let the government, let the opposition get behind this bill. I'd love to see it progressed. Thank you, Speaker.